The vault door was soundless steel, 7 inches thick. Julian Vance stood before it, holding the key, a thing of heavy, cold platinum. He did not open it. He simply held it, watching his own tremor.
The silence of the penthouse was not the sound of peace. It was the absolute, verified proof of absence. Julian had spent 40 years believing that control was the only metric of a worthy life. Control over markets, control over consequences, and eventually, control over silence itself. He had started with nothing but a frantic, relentless need to escape the gray predictability of his childhood. His father, a meticulous, kind man who built custom flocks, had taught Julian precision, but also patience. Patience Julian had no use for. The genesis of Vance Capital required $250,000 in seed money. Julian was 22, and the bank laughed at him. There was only one source: the small, paid-off house his father had built with his own hands.
"The market doesn't wait, Dad," Julian remembered saying, his voice sharp with the certainty of youth. "This loan, secured by the house, is just collateral. We flip the assets in 6 months. It's temporary."
His father, Arthur Vance, had stared at the polished mahogany of his workshop floor. He didn't understand leverage. He understood wood grain, the weight of brass, and the value of a roof over one's head.
He finally signed the papers, his hand shaking slightly. The house was control. Giving it up was a terrifying, gut-wrenching sacrifice.
The money came, and Julian moved with a brutal efficiency of a surgeon. The trade worked. 6 months later, the $250,000 had become $2 million. Julian paid off the mortgage immediately, sending the closing documents back to his father in a Federal Express envelope, a victorious flourish. But the paper felt wrong. It was sterile, not like the solid feel of a title deed held in the hand. The moment Arthur had signed that mortgage, something vital had shifted. The piece of their shared history, the quiet acceptance of simple living, was ruptured by the promise of exponential growth. Julian had leveraged their certainty for his uncertainty. Arthur never returned to the same rhythmic comfort in his shop. He looked perpetually worried, perpetually waiting for the market to demand its pound of flesh again. He saw the world through Julian's spreadsheets now, a place of calculated risk, not inherent safety. He died 9 months later, quietly, of a massive stroke, before Julian had even acquired his second major client. Julian returned for the funeral, standing stiffly beside the grave, feeling the granite weight of a truth he refused to articulate. Success was a multiplier. It multiplied assets, yes, but it also multiplied cost. The cost of that first million was the foundational trust of his family and the life of the only man who had never judged his ambition. He compartmentalized the loss. He decided Arthur's death was coincidence, a cruel alignment of fate, nothing more. To accept responsibility would be to surrender control to regret. Regret was unproductive. He drove faster into the future. The next pillar in his life was Marcus Thorne. Marcus was the anchor during the turbulent mid-20s, the only person Julian allowed into the inner sanctum of Vance Capital. They were co-founders, but Marcus held a minority stake and, crucially, held the ethical center. Marcus believed in building value. Julian believed in extracting it. By the age of 35, Vance Capital was predatory. It targeted mid-sized, undervalued companies, stripped them down, and sold the profitable pieces. It was legal, spectacular, and morally abrasive. Their major confrontation came during the hostile takeover of Omnitech, a generational manufacturing firm in the Midwest. Omnitech was messy, but employed 4,000 people. Julian saw $400 million in liquidatable assets. Marcus saw 4,000 families.
"Julian, we don't have to do this," Marcus argued one wet October evening in the office. The city light smeared across the cold glass walls. "There is clean money to be made. Why does it always have to be the quick?"
"Because the quick kill is decisive," Julian countered, leaning over the war table of documents. His voice was level, almost bored. "Patience is inefficiency, Marcus, and inefficiency is waste. If we don't take Omnitech,
someone else will. Are we moralists, or are we masters of the—
Marcus sighed, a heavy sound that seemed too loud in the polished silence of the boardroom. I thought we were building something durable.
A legacy is defined by scale, not. The breaking point was a non-compete clause Marcus had signed years earlier, a trivial piece of paper Julian had filed away. During the Omnitech struggle, Marcus threatened to leak internal documents regarding some aggressive accounting practices Julian had authorized. It was a bluff, an appeal to conscience.
Julian did not negotiate. He simply activated the non-compete, crippling Marcus financially and legally. It was a maneuver of surgical betrayal, clean and absolute. Marcus was excised from Vance Capital in 72 hours.
He lost his share, his title, and his 2-decade friendship in one single cold transaction.
Julian watched Marcus walk out of the building on the security feed. Marcus looked diminished, shoulders slumped, carrying a single cardboard box. Julian felt nothing triumphant, only a quiet, deep settling. He had just amputated the only remaining part of his life that held him accountable to his younger self. The result was pure, unadulterated control. The markets celebrated. Vance Capital stocks soared 18% in the weeks following the streamlining announcement. Julian Vance was now a monolith, feared and admired, fully insulated from ethical dissent.
The second cost had been paid in full, integrity exchanged for power.
He was 40 years old, a Forbes cover story, residing in a penthouse that felt more like a climate-controlled museum than a home. That was when he met Eleanor. Eleanor was everything Julian was not. She was an art historian, specializing in the quiet chaos of the post-impressionists. She spoke in careful, thoughtful sentences, and she saw the flaws in things, the accidental beauty, the intentional asymmetry. Julian was drawn to her not because she was a social asset, she abhorred the galas he attended, but because she represented a purity he had long since forfeited. He saw her as an oasis, a place where he could momentarily shed the armor of the CEO.
They married swiftly. Julian furnished their life with extreme generosity, providing Eleanor with studio space, travel funds, and a collection of rare, obscure art pieces. He believed this transaction, wealth for presents, was a fair exchange.
In the early years, the love was real, or at least the illusion was expertly maintained. Eleanor tried to pull Julian back, to get him to see the world outside the quarterly reports. "Julian," she once said, tracing the pattern of the frosted glass in the window, "when do you stop accumulating? When is enough?" Julian had paused, genuinely confused. "Enough is only when the system is perfectly stable, Eleanor, when there are no external threats. Wealth is—" Their life together became a study in proximity without intimacy. They shared a bed, a kitchen, a private jet, but they never truly shared a moment. Julian was always running an algorithm in his head, always managing the periphery. When he looked at Eleanor, he saw not his wife, but the proof of his ability to attract beauty and stability, a perfect, high-value reflection of his success. This was the core tragedy of their marriage. Julian had stopped viewing the world and started viewing his reflection within it. The incident that fractured the marriage beyond repair was subtle, almost mundane. Julian had just closed the largest deal of his career, netting him a personal fortune that placed him definitively in the 10-figure bracket. It was late. He arrived home, exhilarated, ready to share the weight of his triumph. Eleanor was sitting on the terrace, reading. The soft light spilled over her shoulder. "We did it," he announced, unable to keep the satisfaction out of his voice. "The Hudson Bay merger. It is sealed. We own." Eleanor closed her book carefully, placing her finger inside to hold the page. She looked at him, not with pride, but with a quiet, devastating clarity. "Julian," she said, her voice low, "when you stand here and tell me about the numbers, you are only talking to yourself. I am just the wall that reflects your words back to." He felt a sudden, piercing coldness. "I am trying to share my life with." No, you are presenting your victory to me. If I were to tell you I am leaving right now, that I am taking nothing and simply walking away, would you hear me? Or would you immediately calculate the loss of reputation and the cost of the...
Julian immediately calculated the loss of reputation and the cost of the settlement. The reaction was automatic, a hard-wired business reflex.
Eleanor saw the calculation in his eyes. She didn't need him to speak. She had her answer.
"I cannot be a stage for your achievement, Julian," she whispered.
She left 3 weeks later. She took only the books and the few pieces of art she had acquired before she met him. She refused the massive financial settlement his lawyers offered. Her absence was the final, echoing sound in the marble and glass prison he had constructed.
Julian Vance was 46. He was exponentially wealthy. He was the undisputed master of his universe. He was entirely alone.
The silence that followed Eleanor's departure was thick, absolute. It was the absence of resistance. His father's gentle critique was gone. Marcus's moral objection was gone. Eleanor's quiet humanity was gone.
All that remained was the system, running perfectly. He began spending hours in the central bathroom, the one with the floor-to-ceiling mirror framed by imported Italian wood. It was an extravagant, beautiful space.
He would stand there after his morning routine, immaculate in his Savile Row suit, knotting his tie.
He looked into the glass. The reflection was perfect. Sharp jawline, tailored shoulders, the slight, determined set of the mouth. The face of an absolute winner. But one morning he saw it. The reflection was merely light bouncing off glass. It showed his physical form, his state of readiness, his wealth, the expensive fabric, the cold gleam of the platinum watch. But the reflection offered no insight. It did not reflect his fear, his emptiness, or the gaping wound left by the 3 souls he had traded for his fortune.
The mirror, he realized, was sterile. It was a functional surface, incapable of mirroring the internal truth. It showed the CEO, but not the man who was decaying beneath the control.
He had built a life so structured, so insulated, that even the natural act of reflection failed. Julian's control began to unravel, not through external threat, but through internal exhaustion. The sheer effort of maintaining the illusion of productive solitude became overwhelming. Every transaction, every negotiation, every dollar earned was a reminder of the price paid. He stopped eating lunch. He stopped checking the futures market before 7 a.m. He started walking. He would leave the penthouse and walk through Central Park, observing people who were oblivious to him, people laughing, arguing over trivial matters, holding hands. They possessed the messy, inefficient humanity he had discarded. They had connection. One afternoon, sitting on a worn wooden bench, Julian felt the cold platinum key in his pocket. It was the key to the main vault, physical proof of 9 figures in liquid assets. He pulled it out, heavy and meaningless in his palm. It was a perfect object, forged from rare metals, entirely symbolic. He began the transfer. It was a complex, meticulous operation, requiring the same brutal focus he had used to build the empire, only in reverse. He was liquidating his entire personal fortune, divesting himself of ownership in Vance Capital, creating a private foundation dedicated to ethical labor and restorative environmental practices. He did not announce it. He did not seek the redemption story. He worked with a team of lawyers who were sworn to absolute secrecy, structuring the trusts and the mandates so that the wealth would be permanently separated from the name Julian Vance. It took 18 months. The sheer volume of assets made the transfer complicated and slow. During this time, his life took on a quiet, almost spiritual rhythm. He continued to manage the company as a professional, emotionless caretaker, preparing the groundwork for his permanent exit. When the last documents were signed, his personal accounts contained only residual cash, enough to cover routine expenses for a year, nothing more. He drafted a concise letter to the board of Vance Capital, announcing his immediate and permanent retirement due to health concerns. He instructed his lawyers to release the details of the foundation only after 90 days.
He wanted 3 months of silence before the explosion of speculation and curiosity began.
On a cold Tuesday morning, Julian stood in the penthouse for the final time. The apartment was pristine, cleaned by staff who were already instructed on the sale process. He left the platinum key on the granite countertop.
He wore simple, unremarkable clothes, a dark wool coat, generic jeans, comfortable boots.
He carried a single, worn canvas duffel bag containing 2 changes of clothes, a well-read copy of Marcus Aurelius, and the framed photograph of his father, Arthur, sitting in his old workshop, smiling proudly over a finished clock.
He took the elevator down, walked out the front door, and hailed a yellow cab. He instructed the driver to take him to Grand Central.
"Where to from there?" the cabbie asked.
"Anywhere quiet," Julian replied.
He bought a one-way ticket on a train heading south, deep into the American interior, a landscape of smaller towns and slower paces.
He chose a window seat and watched Manhattan recede, its glittering towers of glass and steel shrinking into the winter fog. He was no longer Julian Vance, the architect of financial destiny.
He was simply a passenger, sitting next to a stranger, headed toward an unknown destination. He had abandoned control, and in that abandonment, he found a fragile, unfamiliar kind of peace. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt like absence. It felt like space. He settled in a small coastal town in Oregon, working anonymously in a community center, tutoring math to children whose lives were blessedly free of spreadsheets and hostile takeovers. He used a different name, a different history. He was simply a man who showed up on time and did the work. Sometimes, when he looked into the steamed-up window of the local cafe, he saw the faint outline of a face, the face that was no longer obsessed with maximizing returns, the face that was learning to appreciate the inefficient, vital messiness of human connection.
The mirror was finally reflecting something real, even if that something was a man with no measurable wealth.
Julian Vance had disappeared entirely. The legend of the vanishing billionaire would fuel speculation for years, a ghost story in the canyons of Wall Street.
They would never understand that the man hadn't left the world. He had simply walked out of the cage he had painstakingly built for himself.
The true cost of the empire was not paid in taxes or interest, but in souls, and Julian Vance had finally, irrevocably surrendered the empire to settle the debt.
The foundation he established is now one of the largest philanthropic organizations focusing on worker rights and ethical finance, an ironic, permanent monument to the moral compromises of its founder. It is controlled by a board of strangers.
Julian never interferes.
He lives his days by the rhythm of the tides, not the ticker-tape.
But there remains the question of his father, his friend, and his wife. Was the surrender enough? Was the profound, isolating lesson of success worth the destruction it caused?
We will explore the psychological aftermath of true anonymity and how a mind wired for dominance adapts to intentional insignificance in our next long-form documentary. You won't want to miss the story of the woman who found him years later and the secret she carried that could shatter his fragile peace forever.